Hello, this is Dr. Kennedy-Hernandez, and today we're going to be seeing how philosophy may make us better economists and political economists by looking at ontology. Now, when we're talking about ontology with regards to economics, what we're talking about typically is the ontological turn within economics. And put simply, what the ontological turn posits is that different philosophical perspectives approach or see the world quite differently, and this is depending on their ontological commitments. So you may ask yourself, well, what's the point in terms of economics? This is a bit wonky and a bit esoteric. But by understanding ontology and economics, you'll have a better basis for understanding why certain theories and analysis interpret things quite differently from other theories. So, take for instance the difference between neoclassical economics and their emphasis on supply and demand equilibrium vis-a-vis post-Keynesian approaches, which focus on the business cycle, demand stimulus, etc. Or even throw in Marxism for that matter and taking a critical approach. So the upshot to this is that essentially these different philosophical commitments will lead you down a path towards different conclusions or different ways of seeing what's there to interact with in the world. And this will have an effect there on policy as well. Now, when we're discussing the ontological turn itself, what we're really looking at, and this is a personal opinion now, is the rebirth of the Cambridge School of Economics. And you have seminal authors in the field, such as Tony Lawson, who advocated for pluralism within economics, especially as it pertains to models and the methods used. So one of the points Tony Lawson makes that stuck with me is where he mentions, you wouldn't use a hammer to butter your bread. A hammer is a great tool, to drive nails into a wall or a board, but not so good, for other for other uses. Now, some of the works that I find fascinating are Economics and Reality, Reorienting Economics, really two great books that really set this out, the whole ontological turn, this need for pluralism within the field. And you also have other works from Paul Lewis, again showing the pluralism here. An Austrian, Paul Lewis, and Joe Can Run write a paper really challenging the use of formal modeling within economics and basically Paul Davidson's approach to post-Keynesianism. So not only what they were doing is challenging neoclassical or mainstream approaches, but also the method being used, which is, typically in economics, we see formal calculus-based modeling. And what Paul Lewis and Runn did is they said, no, we need a little bit more plurality, even when it comes to methodology. So quite fascinating and interesting, to try to open up economics to a broader base. And, Tony Lawson would consider himself more of a ontologically social theorist. So he's coming from a world where what you have is more social interactions are driving or guiding the markets or how people act within these markets, as well as the institutions themselves, which are, governed by people and laws. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about ontology, we know a little bit about, where this sort of ontological turn within economics comes from. Now we could sort of dig a bit deeper and really ask the question, well, what is meant by ontology? Well, what we're asking is, or what we're seeing is, what can we see? What it is that the philosopher or the scholars are looking at, and then what can then be contemplated therefrom. So in economics, for instance, you might say, what is economics? What's in there? What are the markets? What are they composed of? And what typically drive these? Is it material factors? Is it ideas? Is it a mix of the two? So from there, you'd have very different ways of studying the markets. Again, the material ways, you'd have maybe an Austrian approach on equilibrium or seeking some sort of balance between supply and demand. On the more ideational approach, you might have a Keynesian approach focused more on, business cycles, and you might even have even more social approaches, which just focus on the ideas of agents and how memes sort of spread around within economics and creating this sort of market sentiment. And also, you're also looking at within the ideational realm, you're also looking at negotiations, deliberations, etc. And again, so that last point I'm making on, the different approaches begins to bleed into the epistemology, that is how knowledge is theorized or conceptualized, essentially how you package knowledge. When you're talking about epistemology or questions thereof, what we're looking at is we're really questioning the methods that we use to investigate. So we're essentially what we're doing is we're auditing how we are approaching the world and how we're organizing what we see, in other words. So contrasting a given epistemology to the underlying ontological commitments can help us suss out if our approaches are valid. And then when you contrast the given epistemology or the methods back to the underlying theory and the ontological worldview, you could see if those have a bit of coherence there, if coherence exists. You could suss out if the approach is, if there's a problematics with, you're talking about a social ontology, but you're using a model that's more math based or better equipped to handle, material data. The key would be that not all beliefs are instances of knowledge. And by taking this very simple approach of understanding the ontological coherence, you could see if, by way of an audit, you could see if what the researchers are doing is even making sense, or is it really something that's coherent? So to sort of summarize here, what we're seeing is ontology and epistemology and research. When we're, discerning between the two, what we're looking at is the ontological question is really reckoning with the form and nature of reality. What there is to be known, what it is that we can see, or what there is to see. Now, the epistemological question, it's reckoning with what can be known from what we see. What are the ways of knowing? What is the nature of the relationship between the knower, the researcher, and what he's researching? Now turning to a little bit of a crude caricaturing of some classical Western philosophers, we'll take a look at and dichotomize a bit between Aristotle and Plato's view of epistemology. Now, for Aristotle, epistemology is the science of justified or true belief. Aristotle, what he was seeking were empirical truths in a physical and material world. For Aristotle, establishing universal claims was the end of science and knowledge. So essentially, Aristotle provides the foundation for scientific approaches to, seeking to make generalizations, hypotheses, testing the hypotheses, later on, though, obviously quite later, quite further down the road. Now, Plato, on the other hand, he argues for forms, ideational forms, essentially, I like to call them. And this is rather than empirical truths. So for Plato, the material world is a bit of an illusion. It plays a bit of a trick on us. It's there, but it's based off our rough estimation or our own interpretation, our flawed interpretation of the world. Nonetheless, for Plato, truth really lays in the ideas that we make, the ideal chair, the ideal models, the ideal recollections. And that's basically how he sees truth. It's basically what we recall is what basically guides knowledge. In other words, it's not really there. It's an illusion. So again, now bringing it back to, its role in research, we go back to the methodological question, or we bring it to the methodological question. And we ask how the inquirer could go about finding out whatever he or she believes can be known. In economics, this would translate into the neoclassical theory, and then its equilibrium supply and demand models vis-a-vis the heterodox theories and their methods or their various methodological approaches. But the key here is that there are many ways of doing economics. Trying to understand the different ontological worldviews, we'll begin with the materialist or objectivist worldview. In the objectivist worldview or the perspective, you may see the universe as comprised of distinct objects. And if two humans don't understand things quite in the same way, it's due to our flaws as humans, because there's something out there that's a constant, essentially. So epistemologically, observers get their knowledge about the world by experiencing it. It's essentially possible for humans to investigate the world without influencing it. However, there are recent findings in quantum physics that suggest otherwise. What do they suggest? That essentially that matter is actually affected by observations. So is this a form of agency? I don't know. It's a good question, good philosophical question. Now, turning to the constructivist worldview, constructivist philosophy, again, it originates from the Socratic method, sort of the Platonic view of forms. And again, it's a realistic worldview. It's associated with pragmatism and relativism. And more recently, it's been drawn a lot on in cognitive psychology. But put simply, reality is a construct of two things: the human mind and social interaction. Ultimately, what we're seeing is that reality is subjective. Again, it's perceived. It's one of these forms. And if you go into Plato and you read over the allegory of the cave, you'll get a better understanding or appreciation of what it is that we're trying to see here. We're seeing shadows on the wall as opposed to the object itself, typically. So in this sense, when you apply this to research, what you're saying is that research tends to have its biases, it's tainted by essentially humans. So you're really never going to get to that universal truth, because ultimately it's a form, what we're seeing. And the funny thing about the constructivist worldview is even the ontology itself it's shaped by the users and those that use it. So there is no widely agreed upon view of the paradigm itself. Essentially, again, going back, it's the forms, it's the recollection of it that's actually driving it forward or carrying it forward. There is no reality. And they'll go further into when you're looking at specific case studies, we'll see that they are, what we find or the knowledge that's garnered from them is really local and specific. Thus, they vary between different groups of individuals, etc. So what we see is, like, if we look at, say, how critical theorists might consider liberalism, we'll see that it spreads in a variegated or piebald manner, meaning that it spreads unevenly around. And moreover, constructions are not absolutely true or correct in any sense. Rather, they're more or less informed and complex. And now going on, the constructivist worldview will also suggest that the process of social constructions themselves, they have a lot to do with social and cultural dynamics. Thus, it's not simply in the mind of the individual itself. So, there's a lot of interplay between the outside world, the social world, and the individual, the forms that he then puts together. But ultimately, the point is that reality is socially constructed. In other words, it's not completely personal, and it's neither is it mechanical or even technical. And I mean, think about it as it relates to business or economics. And here what we're going to see is like, how do contracts work? And how do the stipulations within them work? Think of negotiations, think of bargaining. Again, these are very much social interactions. And the same goes with economic policy making, and even think about financial markets when you're thinking about market sentiment, market hysteria, all these different market drivers. So it's not simply based on a 10K report or a 13F filing and an SEC, or some sort of SEC filing. No, what we're looking at is a lot of, again, market sentiment. Nonetheless, some constructions will be problematic. And typically this happens when they're too simplistic, when they're inconsistent, or part of some nefarious project. Again, you probably go look at neoliberalism, or for some maybe Marxism. They'll see this as some sort of nefarious project, or socialism. Depending, and again, it's due to cultural dynamics or perspectives, the way you might, see which one you see that way. Now, turning to different models in research, we'll find that there are positivist models, interpretivist frameworks, pragmatic frameworks, and critical models. Interpretivist frameworks, again, these are the ones that are more relativist, the more typically on the constructivist end, or ontology. In relativism, reality is subjective. It differs from person to person. Our realities are mediated by our senses. Reality is individually constructed within interpretivist frameworks, specifically here. Now, so relativist political economists, these might focus on ideas, how ideas affect institutions, and negotiations. Now, positivism. The ontological position of positivism is realism. So realism would posit that objects have an existence independent of the knower. Again, here, realism exists independently of the researcher. In other words, the researcher and the researched are independent entities. Positivist researchers presume their work is impartial, knowledge is gained absolute and value free. In other words, they claim to be devoid of biases, and it's not created or maintained in any sort of social, political, or historical context. Now, when we're looking at critical realism, historical realism, sort of critical approaches, we might say that this is the view that reality is really shaped by social, political, cultural, economic, and ethnic, and even gender values. And the upshot to the critical approach is really that humans can change reality. And again, after going through this, so we might want to look at, the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. In other words, a posteriori versus a priori. In inductive reasoning, you have a bottom-up approach. So you start with a problem, a conclusion. Essentially, what you're looking at is different patterns or trends, observations, and then from there, you turn into a hypothesis or some sort of generalization. Now, in deductive reasoning, you'll have a top-down approach. You start with premises, facts, truths, essentially theories, and then you develop a hypothesis based off your theory, and then you go out into the world or to your case and make some observations and see if you could either confirm or reject your theories. Now, this may or may not be valid then in the argument. And then essentially what you're doing is, in inductive, you're going from specific, you're looking at the case and then going to general. And then in deductive, you're going from a general theory to more specific understandings. And, again, there's always a time and a place for all of them. In terms of deductive reasoning, if you're at war or whatever, you might use game theory for, the Cold War, missile crisis sort of thing. It's probably better to start from a top-down approach than to wait and see what happens. So in that sense, there are some uses of rational theories where even a heterodox economist like myself might, agree that, this is more appropriate for here, while other ones are not so appropriate. So a bottom-up approach maybe more appropriate for economics, understanding the different trends in economics, and then going forward and extrapolating forward, as opposed to some sort of Cold War scenario or something like that, where the end result is not good. So again, some examples that you might see throughout the course or courses that you take on economics, sort of frame these up for your softball, these up for you very briefly. Again, is when you're looking at deductive modeling, you might think of neoclassical orthodox modeling, where essentially you're taking these theories of supply and demand and equilibrium and using them as a general principle, and then going out into the world and sort of trying to see if they work or if you can make specific claims based on these theories on a particular subject or matter. Now, some of the issues you might run into with this particular approach is that in the real world, sometimes when you're using these, supply and demand equilibrium models, you might be forcing, data into these sort of calculus-based algorithms where it really doesn't fit. And, they're not really based on real world issues. And what you end up with is sort of a derivative of the real world. And much like a fast food burger where, you go to McDonald's and the burger has like you might have like rubber in the bun or something. It's not quite bread what you're eating. So, or it's not quite food for that matter. So now the opposite of that is not always great. And I'll start with the issues and the problems here, is that the inductive approach, since you're coming from the bottom up, it's not going to always be as elegant or neat. So in that sense, you might be getting a bag of flour instead of, some fake bun. So that might be the difference there if you want to see it in that sort of way, to continue that with that analogy. Again, the more nuance means that what you learn is less generalized, generalizable. Wow. Okay. Again, so with that said, in inductive reasoning and economics, you're looking at heterodox modeling typically, and you're starting with observations about the real world problems. Typically, you see the word puzzle pieces. How do we put these puzzle pieces together? And again, this is based off evidence observed in the real world and economic activity. So you're going from there to a general principle, hopefully being formed. And if there's not a principle being formed or anything that can be generalizable, what you end up with is a chronicling or a mapping of whatever it is, whatever case study you're looking at. And that's it. We've reached the end. So I hope that this has been informative. And really the goal of this whole talk was really to allow us to contemplate economics via philosophy in a critical manner, where we're taking a step back, a philosophical step back, and really trying to see what it is that we're looking at here and what are the different approaches and whether they even make sense in a very distilled sense or manner. Again, I hope to see you in our other lectures, and I hope you enjoy our classes, and feel free to comment below, and see you soon. Take care.